Namaste and good evening, everyone. On behalf of Center for Habitat, Urban and Regional Studies at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, Prabhav Evam Niti Anusandhan Sansthan, Nai Delhi, I, Ritika Gupta, Assistant Director at IMPRI, welcome you to IMPRI #Web Policy Talk. Today, we are holding a special lecture on urban employment and social policy in the wake of COVID-19 by Dr. Amit Pasole. I would like to welcome our moderator for today, Dr. Arjun Kumar, who is Director at IMPRI and China India Visiting Fellow at Ashoka University. Sir, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ritika. And I welcome all of you to this very pertinent special lecture on the very hot topic, urban employment and social policy in the wake of COVID-19. As we all know that the budget is just around the corner, and the exodus of migrant workers and what our urbanization has seen, also rural development is important, really focusing upon the social policy. So we really thought to have the research star of our country, Dr. Amit sir, to talk on this subject. His Center for Sustainable Employment at APU has worked a lot last year. So we are so privileged to have him, and also our chair, Professor Santosh Mehrotra, who is another employment and social policy international expert, to contribute to the deliberation. So without any further ado, let me introduce the speaker and chair for today's deliberation. Anshula, why don't you go on?
Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce our chair for the lecture today, Dr. Santosh Mehrotra. He is currently Professor of Economics, Center for Informal Sector and Labor Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Prior to this, he was the Director General of the Institute of Applied Manpower Research, New Delhi. Prior to this, sir. Prior to this. He was the Director General of the Institute of Applied Manpower Research, New Delhi, the only research institute of the Planning Commission, Government of India. He was first head of Rural Development Division and then head Development Policy Division of the Planning Commission from 2006 to 2009. He was one of the authors of India's 11th five-year plan, 2007 to 12, and of the 12th plan, and also led the team on the India Human Development Report, 2011. Dr. Mehrotra held a 3-year appointment at the Center for Development Studies, University of Bath, UK, as Parkin Visiting Professor from 2010 to 13. He has worked with the United Nations Development Programme and UNICEF as well. He is a human development economist, and his research interests have spanned industry and trade issues, the impact of macroeconomic policy on health and education, the informal sector, and the economics of health and education. Welcome, sir, and we are so glad to have you with us today. I would then introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Amit Pasole. He is currently Associate Professor of Economics at the School of Liberal Studies, Azim Premji University, Bangalore, where he also heads the Center for Sustainable Employment. Until 2016, he was an assistant professor at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. He did his PhD work at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. His principal fields of concentration are poverty and inequality, informality, employment, structural change, and political economy of knowledge. He works primarily on the Indian economy. Dr. Basoli has taught BA and MA courses at UMass Boston, UMass Amherst, Bucknell University, and Azim Premji University. These include Principles of Economics, Micro and Macro, Economic Development, Political Economy, BA and MA, Political Economy of Development, Gender and Development, Microeconomics of Development, MA, and Macroeconomics of Development, MA. He holds a previous PhD in neurobiology from Duke University, Durham, North Carolina. He switched fields in 2005 after becoming interested in problems of economic development. Sir, I warmly welcome you today to this special lecture. And with that, I hand it over to Dr. Arjun Kumar, our moderator. Thank you.
Yes, no, we should go really to our chair to give his initial remarks and also to invite Amit sir. Santosh sir. Some connection issues. No problem. I will coordinate. Amit sir, why don't you proceed? Let me welcome you for your special lecture. Yes.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Arjun Kumar. Oh, I think Santosh ji is back.
Yes.
If you would like.
Yeah. It's okay. No, Amit, you continue, please. I'm sorry, I lost connection for a second.
Please. No, sir, please. So please, you can have your opening remarks. We're just
No,
yes.
my only opening remark is that I can't think of a better person than Amit to be speaking on this subject, because he wrote an absolutely outstanding paper on this, which is very widely cited, as it should be. Uh, I, the good news is that he wrote it, in fact, for a book that I edited last year, which has become a bestseller thanks to Amit's paper, I think. not any, doesn't have anything to do with me. But I was just told last week that. So anyway, over to you, Amit. I'm delighted to be actually chairing this. I was listening to him yesterday because they've just done a study on COVID, and so I shouldn't go on too much because Amit and I are friends.
Thank you. Thank you, Santoshji. Thank you, Dr. Arjun Kumar, for the invitation, first of all. I'm very happy to be here and do this talk today. So let me start just by sharing my presentation. What I plan to do in about 30-35 minutes is talk about a little bit about what we know regarding COVID impact and recovery from data. Both data, that's coming from smaller surveys, such as what we have done, other people have done, as well as data from the larger national surveys too, of which there's only one really right now, which is the CMIE survey. But nevertheless, I will present some of this data, which is based on recent work that we have been doing. And most of what I'm going to talk about is really teamwork. I should say this at the beginning, although I am giving the talk, it's really work that we've been doing at the Center for Sustainable Employment. And at the end of the talk, I will direct you to our website, which has a lot more information. So there's a team of about 10 of us, who have been doing a lot of this work over the last year to understand COVID impacts and related policy measures and so forth. So having said that, this is briefly what I hope to cover. So after a brief introduction, I'll go into what we know about employment impact and recovery, what we know about income impact and recovery, and then go into the policy response and its effectiveness so far and the way ahead. I believe most of the interest would be in these last parts there, and that's also where some of the debate can happen on what more is needed to be done. So I'll try to get to that as quickly as I can. It's important to bear in mind before we go into the COVID situation that, as most people would know, there was a slowdown happening in the Indian economy several quarters prior to COVID. And the causes, again, fairly well understood, if not in a very rigorous way, at least in a descriptive way. We know that demonetization and GST rollout immediately preceding COVID, and then the somewhat medium run factors such as the NPA crisis, and then on top of which are the long run structural weaknesses of the Indian economy, again, which are too well known to bear repetition here. These are all building up to the slowdown that we were seeing since 2015 or so, on the back of which COVID has come. The link between employment growth, structural change, and GDP growth has also been weak in India. So this goes back to the long run structural weaknesses of the Indian economy. The growth rate of employment is much smaller than the growth rate of working age population. Professor Mehrotra has written extensively about this, so I won't really talk too much about that here. We simply haven't been generating enough employment. In fact, not only, I'm not talking only about good jobs here. In a general sense, we haven't been creating enough employment opportunities given the working age population. And when I say working age population, I'm actually excluding those who are 15 to 25. So we've done some recent work which excludes this age group, which usually is included in India in the working age definition. But with the changing education profile, a lot of people are not in the labor force in this age group because they are in education, which of course is a good thing. So even if we restrict our analysis to 25 years and above working age population, we still find that the growth rate of the working age population is much higher than the growth rate of the workforce, with the result that we find a decline in the work participation ratio, the WPR, as well as a rise in the unemployment rate, which has been in discussion quite a lot. So that is the situation leading into COVID. Now, COVID, of course, again, has, as is becoming very painfully obvious, the impact has been exacerbated by all the structural vulnerabilities that the economy has. So the highly impacted sectors are also large employers, particularly in urban areas. Trade, transport, hospitality, manufacturing, and construction, all large employers and all highly impacted as per the ILO classification. And also, generally intuitively, we can understand why that is the case. Moreover, these sectors are not only large employers, but also large informal employers. So the dominant nature of employment is precarious with little or no job security, and there's little or no social protection available via employers. Further, the social safety net is rooted in domicile and not workplace, which leads to the now, in retrospect, very obvious effect of COVID, which was that it affected migrant workers the most devastatingly. Because they were at the intersection of all of these things. They were in the high impact sectors, they were in precarious jobs, they had no social protection from employers, and the existing social safety net, as far as the government was concerned, was mostly in domicile and not in workplace, whether one talks about PDS or Manrega, the two big ones. So this made migrant workers particularly highly vulnerable to the crisis, on top of which, of course, low incomes and low savings meant that they could not survive in their workplace for even a few weeks and had to immediately go back to their home villages and hometowns in order to simply survive. So this was a preventable tragedy, of course, in hindsight, but there you have it. Since this is particularly focused on urban employment, I just thought I'd spend a minute talking about the particular challenge of urban employment. And here, the pattern of economic growth becomes very important. So not only is the Indian pattern of economic growth not able to create adequate amount of employment, which I alluded to earlier, but also there is a fairly lopsided nature to this growth, particularly in the last 20 years or so. We have seen a very metro-focused and a very regionally imbalanced type of growth. So there are big imbalances between labor supply and labor demand right now in India, which create these long distance migration flows, which I can tie back to what I said earlier about the vulnerability of migrant workers. So that makes the urban employment challenge particularly tricky, but also urgent to address. I'm getting a slight echo. I'm not sure what this is.
No, that's
Yeah.
Kunal, sir. We'll just, no problem.
Yeah. You can hear me clearly, right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, okay. There is also, if one steps out of the informal sector for a bit and migrant workers and so forth, and looks at the educated, then you see a mismatch between aspirations and reality, especially for educated youth. And this is again a big topic. Professor Mehrotra again is here, who has written a lot about this. So I won't go into it now. Right now, we can talk about it in discussion later. But one way in which you can see this mismatch clearly is if you simply look at the rate of open unemployment by education and by age. So I'll show you this graph here, which is from the PLFS. This is showing you, for different education levels, what is the rate of open unemployment in the age group of less than 30 and greater than 30. The less than this is an arbitrary division. Obviously, you can do different divisions. My definition here of youth is those who are less than 30 years of age, which are the blue bars, and the greater than 30 are the red bars. And what you see, two things. One, of course, as is well known, the rate of open unemployment is much higher for the higher educated, because that is where they can afford to remain unemployed. So I don't want to belabor that point. But the other point here is that there is a big difference between the blue bars and the red bars, showing that for every level of education, once you cross the age of 30, open unemployment is not really a problem, meaning you found something to do. Now, whether that something is what you aspired for or not is, of course, a different issue, and mostly it is not, particularly given earnings and job security kind of considerations. So this high level of youth unemployment rate among the educated youth that you see really points to this issue of what do the youth want, particularly in urban areas, and what is on offer in the labor market. So with these brief kind of setting the stage remarks, let me come to what COVID did to the employment and incomes situation in the country. So let me just step back. Let me orient you to the kind of data I'll be showing, mainly from two sources. The CMIE Consumer Pyramid Survey, of which again a lot has been written recently because it's the only nationally representative data set available for COVID analysis. I'm happy to go into the details of the survey later. Right now, I'm just going to give you the numbers. And the second source is our own COVID survey and similar surveys done by many other civil society organizations, academics, and so forth, which are purposive sample surveys. They cannot be generalized to the general population. They're generally targeted towards vulnerable households, BPL households, and so forth, and try to present a picture of what has happened there. Okay? So those are the two things that I'll talk about. So here I'm showing you the WPR, the workforce participation rate, which is the percentage of working age population that is employed over a period from April 2019 to December 2020. There are two different axes here for men and women because in the CMI data, women have very low WPRs, even much lower than PLFS. I mean, India, of course, has a well-known problem of low female participation rates, but even beyond that, the CMI data tends to have very low numbers, as you can see here on the right-hand axis. Again, I can go into this later if people are interested in what might be the reasons for this. But the main point I'm making here on this slide is whether you look at urban or rural, male or female, of course, the WPR took an expectedly sharp dive in April, which is not a surprise in the lockdown month. But then by August, the recovery had started. Disappointingly, though, December did not see a continuation of the recovery for any of the demographic groups. In the next few slides, for men, the recovery is a little better. For women, it's not so good. Nevertheless, for all of them, recovery has stalled a little bit when it comes to, at least by December. I should point out that these time points, April, August, December, are chosen because the CMI is a panel survey that interviews each household 3 times in a year. So what we have done is followed people for the 3 times that they were interviewed. And the structure of the panel is such that if you were interviewed in April, the next time you would be interviewed would be in August and then in December. That's why most of what I'll be presenting will be from these time points. So this is the first big point. Now, to supplement that kind of decline in WPR that we see with what happened to vulnerable households, we can go to some purposive surveys that I alluded to earlier. And here I'm summarizing 3 different lockdown surveys, including our own and one by ActionAid and one by Dalberg, that were all done in April, May, June time period. And there you see very large impacts in terms of the percentage of people who lost jobs. What I'm showing you here are of the workforce pre-COVID, how many had lost work. So about 80% of the urban vulnerable workforce, right? This is not again representative of the urban workforce totally, because for that we have to go to CMIE, where the impact will be smaller because CMIE also has a lot of regular wage workers and others who are not as impacted by the lockdown. But among the vulnerable workers, the lockdown had a very large impact. And these different surveys sort of agree more or less that the urban was affected more than the rural, and also in terms of the level itself, there is broadly agreement, which is encouraging because none of these, as I said, are representative. So we would like to triangulate and get different pieces of information here. What we have done recently is we went back and re-interviewed our own workers to our own interview sample too. So we had done a lockdown survey in April, May, as I said, of about 5,000 workers. In October, November, we re-interviewed about 2,800 of those. We managed to reach about 2,800 of those. And now we are looking at that panel of what happened to them. So what I'm showing you now is of the pre-lockdown workers, which is 100%, everybody was working in February, who was working in lockdown, and then what happened post-lockdown. When I say post-lockdown, I'm talking about September, October. Okay? So in our survey, what we find is, again, the lockdown had a very large impact. In this sample, 70% overall lost work. This is not rural, urban. It's desegregated, it's combined. 70% had lost work during the lockdown. By October, about 20% were still jobless. So there's a recovery clearly. right? The majority have actually regained work, but our threshold of definition is very low. In this survey, we have counted anyone as employed if they had even 1 day of work in the previous month. Okay, so we kept the bar low because we really wanted to see what is the most conservative definition of impact here. So 20% of workers have been out of work even as late as 6 or 7 months after the lockdown, and these are all workers who come from households that have an average income of about 10,000 rupees a month. So we are talking about workers who really need to work to survive. So this is not a very good sign as far as the recovery is concerned. Urban areas in particular are lagging behind rural areas. So what I'm showing you here is lockdown and post-lockdown, rural and urban. What is the distribution of those who are employed and those who are out of work, right? So just breaking it down, and what you see is both during lockdown, the rural was affected less. Only 58% were out of work in the rural areas as opposed to 85% in urban areas. Post-lockdown, the rural recovery and bounce back is much more compared to the urban. So in urban, 27% are still unemployed, out of work. And as I said, the bar is very low. So this is a distress situation for these 27% of workers in our sample in the urban areas. We've also done some work which I can go into again later if people are interested, just based on PLFS, looking at what is the degree of vulnerability in the urban workforce. So if you look at self-employed and casual workers in the high and medium risk sectors, that's about 45% of total urban employment in 2018-19, according to the PLFS. So 45% of urban workers were at high risk because they had precarious jobs and in the high and medium risk sectors. Right? The share of urban workers who are at the lowest risk were about 12% of total employment. So again, you can gauge the extent of the employment effect. We've also been doing some work, and I can refer you to the more detailed articles and papers on our website on this, tracking workers through the pandemic. So this takes advantage of the CMIE panel and looks at, follows an individual worker through December, April, and December. So December last year, then the lockdown month, and then December this year, and we say, okay, what happened to them? If they were employed pre-lockdown, did they lose work in April in the lockdown? And if they lost work, did they regain work? Right? So you can have different trajectories. You can have people who were not impacted, who remained employed all the way through, people who lost work but then regained it, right? Who recovered, people who lost work and couldn't regain it, so they haven't recovered, and so forth. So you can classify people this way. That's one thing that we've done. And the other thing we have done is we've also classified people based on having lost work. So conditional on losing work in April during the lockdown, did you recover or did you not? Did you recover by August, and could you hold on to your job by December? So was your recovery stable or was your recovery unstable? Or did you have no recovery at all? So this is another kind of analysis that you can do. And these are two papers that we have. The first one is completed, the previous slide that I showed, and which is on our website. This one is still being worked up, but we've written a short article recently in Hindustan Times on this trajectory analysis that I will refer you to. So I'm just going to show you some broad numbers from here. These are male-female numbers. Interestingly, there isn't a whole lot of difference between urban rural when you look at this kind of an analysis. But there is a big difference between male and female workers. So I'm showing you that here. So this is the first kind of trajectory where we look at what proportion of workers were not affected and what proportion were affected and have not recovered, and so forth. So what you see overall, you can look at the overall numbers. About 57% are not affected in the CMI sample. Okay, so you can already see that this sample is quite different from the vulnerable workers sample, because there you saw that about 70 to 80% of workers had lost work. Here, it's about 40% or 45% of workers who have lost work in the lockdown. So clearly, this is a different kind of a sample. But the difference is very stark for men and women. So for men, 60% not affected. For women, only about 19% not affected. Right? So women, 80% of women were affected in some ways. Either they lost work and haven't recovered, or they've lost work and recovered. But even in the no recovery category, women are worse off. So you'll see here that women are about 46.6, about 47% of women still had not recovered by December, right? About 6-7 months after the lockdown, they were still out of work, while that was only 7% for men. Uh, uh, so not only did women lose work, they were more likely to lose work, they were less likely to come back, but also if you look at the nature of their recovery, they are more likely to have an unstable recovery as well. So here I'm showing you again overall men and women numbers for no recovery. So they lost work in April, they could not find work in August or in December. This is the no recovery sample. And that you can see is 13% of men, but 56% of women. So, there's a stark difference. But again, interestingly, overall, 19 or about 20% of workers, even in the CMI sample, have not recovered by December. Okay? So that's a fairly large number of people who are still out of work, as of December. Okay? I'll not go into this too much for lack of time. I can talk about it later if you're interested. The recovery has meant an informalization. So those who were regular salaried workers earlier have come back into the workforce after the lockdown, but not necessarily as regular salaried workers. So for 100 regular salaried workers in December, which is the leftmost bar, meaning if you look only at regular salaried workers in December, then by April, by August, and by subsequent December, you see that only about 43 or 44% of those are able to remain in salaried employment. The rest are in informal work, or they are out of the workforce, meaning that they're not working at all. Okay? So there is either a lack of work or an informalization of work that has happened in the recovery. Very briefly about income. We do know again from several purposive surveys that have been done by us and by others that earnings really took a hit, not only during the lockdown but subsequent to the lockdown as well. So in our survey, about 40 to 50%, there was an earnings shortfall that happened. In the Dalberg survey, there was an average decline of 65% in monthly income, and the lowest quintiles were hurt the most. So this took the form either of having fewer days of work for casual workers or a fall in the wage rate as well. Okay, so there were both kinds of effects going on. But the sum total of it was that people lost earnings to a fair degree. Okay? In the Dalberg survey, the bottom 20% had a 70% loss in their income, okay, compared to 51% for the top quintile. I'll come a little bit more to the inequality aspects of the income loss in just a couple of slides. I'm going to skip this slide. Just show you what we found in our survey post-lockdown. So what I was showing you now was the lockdown effect, that in April and May, 2 months, earnings took a big hit. People lost basically 2 months worth of income, right? And those who could least afford to lose it, lost it. What we find in September, October in our second round survey is that if you had work by September, October, then your earnings were more or less what they were before lockdown. So if this is the ratio that I'm showing you of the post to pre-lockdown earnings ratio. Okay? So if it's less than 1, it means that you're earning less post-lockdown. Now, if you include everyone, those who don't have work, then of course the overall earnings ratio is less than 1, because a lot of people don't have any earnings at all. But if you condition it on having earnings, meaning having earned some income in both periods, then you see the ratio is close to 1. It's about 1.03 for rural, 0.9 for urban. So urban is little less, again, lagging behind in recovery. But there is a recovery. If you've got work, you've got the earnings. But if you don't have work, of course, that's a different story. Right? So overall, in urban, that 0.4 number is telling you that at an aggregate level, urban incomes in this population of vulnerable workers is still 40% of what it was pre-lockdown. So you can see that if this is an indicator of a broader trend, then you're talking about huge income effects. Right? Going to the CMIE data, which is now nationally representative, here's what we find when we look at per capita household incomes. Okay, these are now household incomes in per capita terms that we are looking at, following from about roughly February of last year, February of 2020, before the lockdown, over to August. August is the most recent data that we have from CMIE on incomes. It doesn't go beyond that. But you can see, again, this sharp fall in April, followed by a gradual recovery, but still not up to pre-lockdown levels as of August. And of course, urban took a much bigger hit than rural. Rural is always less than urban because on average, rural households are poorer, but the rural-urban gap really narrowed during the lockdown because the rurals were impacted less and urban were impacted a lot. Okay? By deciles, you see that the poorest deciles suffered a lot. Okay, so this is year-on-year growth now. So it's showing you compared to the comparable month last year, what was the growth in your income? Of course, all growth is negative here because incomes fell. But they really fell for the bottom deciles. Okay? The top deciles were significantly less affected. We've calculated that the bottom deciles would have lost around 17,000 rupees of income cumulatively over about a 6-month period during COVID from April to August. 17,000 rupees is about 3 months of income that has just gone from these households' balance sheets. Okay? Okay, so I'll skip some of this and come to the policy response now in interest of time. I'll go over these things quickly because I think it's all familiar to people. What has been the response thus far? Broadly, it was PDS expansion, free grains. This was the Garib Kalyan Yojana at the beginning. There was an increased Manrega outlay that everybody would know about, the Jan Dhan transfers and the one-time NSAP payments. There was a front loading of PM Kisan. There was a rerouting of some funds through the Rozgar Abhiyan. And of course, there was the liquidity-based support through the ECLGS and so forth. All of this adds to an above-the-line fiscal outlay. So I'm not talking about liquidity, monetary measures. I'm talking only about fiscal measures. Fiscal outlay of about 2 to 3% of GDP. You may go up to 4% depending on estimates, which is on the low side in international perspective. So there's a lot of room for India to do a lot more. We have been fairly conservative on the fiscal side. On PDS, it has been effective. Okay, our survey, we see that most households got grains. Okay, if they had a ration card, then they got grains. But not everyone got the free grains. Okay? So if you conditional on having a ration card, you're definitely receiving grains. And that's true in rural and urban, although as expected, urban is weaker than rural. The PDS network is less functional in urban, as we also know. So, lower proportion of urban workers availed of the grains. But what is more important, I don't have a slide on this, so I'll just mention it. What is more important is that people had received grains, but they had not necessarily received the extra entitlement of free grains. Okay, the proportion of people, households that had that was much lower. Something like 30% said that they had got those free grains. Jan Dhan, again, if you conditional on having an account, 70% say they got transfers. But to begin with, only about 30 to 40% had accounts. Okay, so as a population, Jan Dhan doesn't reach very well. But if you have a Jan Dhan account, then it has that kind of penetration. Of course, we can do well on both counts. We can do well on increasing accounts as well as ensuring that those payments actually get there. Okay? I'll skip this. And this, I just want to talk about a minute on state level innovations. Okay, so there's a lot of attention given to central policies on PDS, NREGA, and so forth, Jan Dhan. But states have also done a lot of work in COVID because they were at the front lines. So many states expanded the lists of beneficiaries. People on the waiting list were incorporated. The scope of PDS was expanded to include other things as well. So in terms of beneficiaries as well as in terms of items, it was expanded. Cash transfers, a lot of states announced augmented cash transfers above and beyond Jan Dhan to targeted groups, migrant workers, weavers, auto drivers, all of this kind of thing. We don't really know about the effectiveness of these transfers. So I haven't seen a comprehensive study yet on whether these worked. Right, there were a lot of them were announced, but I haven't seen much research on this. And then the most interesting for us, there were several innovations with respect to employment programs. Odisha, Himachal, Jharkhand all introduced a specific urban employment program. Some of them are actually called guarantees also, which tried to deal with the employment crisis in urban areas. Okay, so in the last few minutes, I'd like to talk about the way ahead. Arjun, how am I doing on time?
Yes, please go ahead. No problem.
Yes. Okay, So let me just take 5-10 minutes or no more to wrap this up. Do we need additional fiscal support? Yes. What can we do? So there are many things out there, and Professor Mehrotra just before we started was talking about some of these issues that he himself has been writing about, which hopefully he will come in with later on. One can do a lot of these things. Something is definitely needed to be done still based on what we find has been the income effect. So as I mentioned, at the bottom deciles, households have lost a lot of income, as a result of which they've taken on debt. I did not present the data on debt, but there are some evidences that indebtedness had risen, distressed sale of assets has risen. So household balance sheets are in a bad shape, and that can have long-term effects. So you may respond by saying, well, if people are getting their work back, they're getting their incomes back, what is the problem? The problem is that if they've incurred debt, or if they've had to pull children out of school, or they had to defer health treatment and so forth, that can all potentially have long-term effects. Long-term food insecurity, which we have seen also happen, can have long-term effects. Okay, so all of this potentially has a long-term impact there. So we need to address this. Cash transfers can be done. Manrega can be expanded in various ways. A national urban employment guarantee scheme can be thought of. I'll talk about that very briefly in the next few slides. PDS can be universalized. Now, all of these things are, I think, good short-term measures that will significantly improve the situation of vulnerable households, and we should consider doing any or all of them. In the medium to long run, this is also an opportunity to improve our social protection systems, because they've been found sorely lacking. Alongside the continued policy focus on scaling up enterprises and formalizing them, which is of course a good agenda, broadly an infrastructure compliance agenda, we can think of these following things. We can think of a wider cash transfer net. We can think of an unorganized sector welfare board. This is an idea that has been around for a long time, since the Sengupta Commission. Professor Mehrotra has a detailed paper on this that he has done, which is up on our website, also our center's website, which I recommend very highly, on understanding how this can be done, a universal roadmap for social security. One can have a wider micro enterprises policy net, such that direct income support or wage subsidies can be delivered via enterprises. Something that been done in advanced industrialized countries, but of course harder to do in India. But we could consider it. I'll spend a couple of minutes on this, because this is something that we've been doing a lot of work on over the last year, which is a national urban employment guarantee. State level schemes, which I referred to, including Kerala has one as well, can provide ideas for the design. We proposed a detailed framework last year, which again I refer you to our website. Jean Drèze recently had another version that he proposed called the Decentralized Urban Employment and Training Program, which is also very worth considering. The key features here, as far as we are concerned, are that you're talking about something that is self-targeted, as Manrega is, maybe 100 days, sort of near urban casual wage program, right? You set the wage somewhere where the local wage for urban casual work sits. You do public works. You can do traditional public works. Sorry, there's a typo here. It should not be workers, it should be works. Traditional public works plus ecological services and care services. So we've got a detailed list of potential works that can be undertaken in our towns and cities through such a program that will improve the quality life and ease of doing business in cities, while also creating work for casual workers. And the urban local bodies would be key players over here. There are some concerns that have been raised, and I can go into this in the Q&A. There's a concern about whether it will further exacerbate the migration situation if such a program is launched in cities. So what do we do about that? Do we restrict it to urban residents? Do we pitch a wage that is close to the Manrega wage so that there isn't a high differential? There are different ways of handling this. What do we do about the fact that ULBs do not undertake public works a lot of the time, rather they contract it out to private contractors? So then how does such a program work? Right? So we have some ideas about that. Could there be a lack of labor supply? Would workers actually turn up for work? Or is there already enough work that they have in urban areas, notwithstanding COVID? I mean, COVID is of course an exceptional situation, but as things go back to normal, will workers really want to work in a government program in urban areas? Because we don't have the kind of seasonal unemployment in urban areas that we do in rural areas. Is there a lack of labor demand? Meaning, is there enough work to do in towns and cities that we can assure a guaranteed number of days of work? We think there is. Okay? For the upcoming budget, I would say, we should at least maintain an increased allocation of 1 lakh crores for Manrega going forward for 1 year. PDS, at least a 10% increase on last year's budget, which is basically just including people who are excluded, okay, including migrant workers. NSAP has been unforgivably low, 200 rupees a month for years now, and that needs to be fixed. And an urban employment guarantee can be introduced. If we don't want to do a national program straight away, it can be a pilot scheme, and we've done some costing around that, and we think that for around 50,000 crores, which is something like the NREGA budget pre-COVID, you can do a scheme that can cover about half of all urban casual workers. So I'll stop here, and I have some framework of employment policy that I thought I would discuss, but I don't think I have that much time for it. So I'll go to the discussion and then maybe come back to some of these issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Amit sir. Very interesting points. I have jotted down many questions regarding work and everything. But let me first call our chair for this deliberation, Professor Santosh Mehrotra, to reflect upon some of the points, and then, Sir Santosh sir, we can open up for panel discussion.
Indeed. Thank you very much indeed, Amit. That was outstanding, only as outstanding as I expected. Let me make 3 or 4 points quickly. First of all, let me say that I fully and wholeheartedly have been endorsing your case for the urban employment guarantee for at least a year. I speak about it publicly all the time. So let's discuss that a little bit more, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But let me actually make a few points to elaborate on Amit's reasons why we need it now. Now, above all, more than before, even more. One, I think he's already provided the reasons in his analysis of the CMI data and the Azim Premji University's own livelihood survey data, which shows that the labor market is nowhere close to being back where it was. And also because there is some misapprehension in government thinking that, oh, the rural areas are doing fine. There's been a great monsoon. There's been outstanding and unprecedented agricultural output. So it's agriculture which is going to bail the economy out as we move forward, which I found amusing beyond belief, because I've never really understood how a sector which accounts for 14 to 15% of GDP is suddenly going to bail the economy out. Secondly, I think Amit's analysis shows very clearly that actually the labor market in rural areas is not recovered, unlike what most people think. And how could it have recovered? It's just unthinkable that it could have recovered, because millions of people have gone back and they're looking for the same work that earlier a smaller number of people. So we've essentially gone back to a situation which prevailed 15 years ago until 2004-5, when the absolute number of workers in agriculture was increasing. It's only since 2004-5, when non-farm work really grew extremely rapidly, that at least until 2012, that non-farm work, that workers were pulled out of agriculture and the absolute number of workers in agriculture fell. Another argument, which in a sense for urban Manrega, is the following, which I find it interesting that Amit doesn't make it, but I always make it, and I would like Amit's views and those of others on this, which is the following: that at this juncture, because with millions of workers having gone back to rural areas, what we do need is workers coming back to urban areas. There is, to some extent, a labor supply problem. And I mean, my friends in the MSMEs tell me that there are labor shortages. So if you did have an urban employment guarantee, it would tend to pull workers back. The third reason is the following: that given this, that the state is actually facing a fiscal crisis, the severe shortage of funds, and therefore a urban employment guarantee would be substitutive of spending on Manrega, because if you add workers in the urban areas, this will actually pull workers back away from rural areas, so there'll be less demand for rural Manrega. So the pressure on the fisc would reduce while you would be spending more on urban, while at the same time improving infrastructure. So I'm very strongly in favor of urban employment guarantee at this point. And honestly, if we did have an urban employment guarantee, we'd be spending less. And of course, I'd be delighted if we also had a cash transfer for some 60% of our poor population at only 500 rupees per household. It would actually cost no more than 0.4% of GDP, as I've estimated in a separate paper which is published for ICRIER. And as Amit rightly pointed out, I'd be even more delighted if, following on the Social Security Code that the government has now finally passed, it would actually act on it. If it was to act on it, I've estimated this in a more detailed paper than which is in fact on Amit's on the Azim Premji University site, which I'm just finished for the Asian Development Bank, which would cost really very little if we were to provide social security, in other words, old age pension, death and disability insurance for the poor in our country, incrementally, obviously, for over the next 5 years. And that together, these three things, urban employment, a cash transfer, and social security, would actually cost no more than 1.2% of GDP, and it would raise aggregate demand, and it would revive our economy, which is not going to see an increase in per capita income, or forget about increase. We're not even going to get to 2019 levels of per capita income by 22-23. Okay, let's open it up to questions. I've already spoken for longer than I had intended. Who'd like to go first?
Yes, so sir, let us call, but the 1.2% really turns out to be around 2.5 lakh crores, Santosh sir, what you are suggesting.
Say that again, I didn't hear that.
That will be around 2.5 lakh, so 1.2% when you're saying that will be around.
Yes, you're right. Yes. I'm saying together all three things.
Yes. Okay. So let us go to our first panelist for the day. We have Dr. Neeraj V. Prasad sir. Neeraj sir, are you there? Yes, sir, your video.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes. So Neeraj sir is assistant professor at OP Jindal Global University. Yes. Neeraj sir, why don't you go on? Dr. Neeraj Prasad, can you hear? We can hear you. Yes, please go on.
Hello.
Yes, please go on.
Am I audible? Am I connected?
Yes, we can hear you.
Good evening. Good evening. Thank you for this excellent presentation, which has a lot of details. It has a lot of your estimates, and it is backed by rich amount of data, a lot of primary data that you have collected, and that's always very difficult to find in India. But these are certain issues on which I do a lot of work on inequality and political mobilization, both in violent and non-violent contexts. And whenever I'm looking for data in this domain, your website is something I look forward to. My main question over here is to do with counterfactuals. Whenever we are doing some kind of policy recommendations, there is always a counterfactual. In the US context, a lot of people say that had Donald Trump done this or done that, we would have avoided 400,000 deaths. But we all know that given that there is a pandemic, it's not that anything that we would have done or they would have done would have avoided all 400,000 deaths. Maybe there would have been 50,000 deaths, or 350,000 could be avoided, or maybe there would have been 100,000 and 300,000 could have been avoided. So when we are talking in terms of these impacts, it is good to know in terms of what are the counterfactual that we're talking about. Because a lot of the employment numbers that you give and a lot of these income loss numbers that you give, we see a strong recovery. Now, had the government intervened in a way that you suggest it should have, or had we not had these kind of inefficiencies in our system, then what would have been the counterfactual? How much of this loss of income, how much of this loss of employment could have been avoided? Even with good policy, even with a good kind of a feedback mechanism. Because if we are saying that there was, say, a loss of 10% or 15% in the long run, then well, there was a pandemic. There has to be some economic losses. There has to be some losses in terms of unemployment. There is some damage to the economy. Now, how much of that damage occurred in the long run, and how much of that could have been avoided? That is the question. So what is the counterfactual that we are talking about? Thank you.
Thank you, Neeraj sir. So just moving over to our next panelist, we have Varun Agrawal, who is the founder and lead at India Migration Now. Varun, why don't you go on?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Kumar.
Video, Varun?
Yeah, I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you're
yeah, Professor Basole, to our chair, thank you very much, Professor Basole. Thank you for that summary. And unfortunately, my video, if I start my video, it will really slow down matters. So it's just to preserve bandwidth, if it's okay to go without video. So I suppose I come from a migration perspective, and one of the goals we have and what we think a lot about from both the research and advocacy perspective is how do we mainstream migration into the relevant policy areas, right? And we believe we don't need a dedicated migration policy. We need migration to be something to be considered in different policy aspects. In fact, we built an index called the Interstate Migrant Policy Index, called IMPEX, which has looked at all the states in India from a destination perspective. We have looked at we have different categories of policies, like labor market, child migrants, healthcare, education, and so on. And we've sort of first, aggregated all the state level policies relevant to each of these policy areas. We have indicators, we score them. And that's a very revealing sort of exercise, because this notion of domicile, and I think it was a great point you touched upon in one of your earlier slides, Dr. Basole, about how a lot of schemes and policies are grounded in workplace and not are grounded in sort of domicile. A domicile is a basis for a lot of how things work. And so I want to sort of almost frame this as a question, an open question, which I struggle with. And I think the urban Manrega debate is I think and epitomizes this question, which is, on one hand, if you look at labor market dynamics, it's very clear that migrant labor, and especially interstate migrant labor, is essential to fill the demand, the labor labor supply that is required. And even if you do an urban Manrega program, I read your proposal, I read Dr. Drez's proposal, and it's the kind of jobs which have been proposed to be created under such a scheme. Only, I think, if you look at labor market dynamics, migrants are going to be key in filling those gaps, right? So the labor market dynamics suggest that you need migrant labor, especially interstate migrant labor. But if you look at the political economy of it, which is where domiciles come into play, this idea that if we do urban Manrega, will attract a disproportionate number of migrant laborers to the big cities. There is this tension. There's a labor market requirement, and there's a political economy sort of fear of a backlash from natives if too many migrants from out of state come in. how do we reconcile this, especially in the context of urban Manrega? Because this issue is not just true in urban Manrega, but it's coming in various policies. And I see it as the biggest barrier, this tension, to mainstreaming migration into our policy discourse and policy implementation. So I want to frame this as an open question. I would love to see other panelists and Dr. Basole and everybody else respond to that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Varun. So moving over to our next panelist, we have Ms. Urvashi Prasad ma'am, who is a public policy specialist at the Office of Vice Chairman, Niti Aayog. Ma'am, over to you. Urvashi ma'am.
Yeah.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I'm in a very bad signal area, so apologies. I did not. Unfortunately, I missed most of the presentation, so I'll have to go through that later. But yeah, I just got to hear some of the comments, discussions, right now. And yeah, so I think I would make maybe a couple of comments here more from the social policy perspective. That's more sort of my forte. And I think there, the urban context is one, and I worked, previously before I was in the government, I actually worked for several years on programs for the urban poor when I was at the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation. So I think the urban context, especially the urban poor, there's so many, differences, and in the government, one of our challenges is that most of our programs are actually designed for rural populations, and then when I think of the health system, the nutrition system, I think you mentioned PDS, and various other infrastructure as well as the overall programs have actually all been designed primarily with a rural lens. So I think that is really at the heart of what we face, and of course a lot of those challenges will get exacerbated in the COVID times. But I think that is quite critical when we think from the policy point of view, whether it's in health, whether it's in nutrition, how do we design programs which are actually impactful and effective for the urban population, given the very different context that we see here compared to rural areas where we can rely on certain structures. So I think that is something, like in rural areas, you often find the groups within the villages, the women's groups, the other community networks being much stronger. And so, you can leverage those quite effectively. In fact, even in the pandemic, a lot of those self-help groups have been leveraged to play a big role in producing various kinds of masks and other equipment. And that's, of course, also generated economic opportunities for them. But in urban areas, we've often found the equivalent, to be difficult, because you don't often have that kind of cohesion or those kind of natural community and social structures. So what do you really, think of here in terms of the program design and the scheme design? And I think that's where, on the policy side, really, we still grapple a lot in terms of thinking for the urban context. And I think that is where we need to move towards. Obviously, ideas and learning on that are very useful in terms of how we bring in that kind of lens. But that's where we need to go. We've been doing a lot of work at NITI here, for instance, on the urban nutrition system and how we think of the nutrition system for urban areas, including the urban slums, and of course that also brings in the PDS and other elements. But really thinking of it from completely a fresh lens, rather than saying, okay, here's a program that we've had working in rural areas for all these years, and we kind of just copy-pasted it or supplanted it into the urban context, and here it's how it's working here. So I think that's what I would say at a sort of more general, higher level. But yes, I would love to listen to the actual presentation, and I'm sure I would have more precise comments as well as questions then. Thank you.
Dr. Kumar, if I could just add one thing to what the very, very important point Ms. Prasad has made. Could I just make
Yes, Yes, sir. Yes, Varun.
I mean,
Okay.
I just want to add, like, the World Bank has made a huge facility, almost $1 billion facility, of just focusing on the delivery of welfare available to the Indian government during in the summer. And the basis of that, if you look at the research which influenced their thinking, it's just to add to the great point Ms. Prashad just made. It's not just that our welfare policies assume ruralness, but they also assume they're static, right? They also assume that households are static and rural. And when in reality, what the lockdown has revealed, the crisis we saw, is that poverty increasingly is not just urban, but it's also highly mobile, and it's in very dense areas. So the challenges of delivery, as Ms. Prashad was saying, are very different. So I just want to add that to what she was saying, because we do need to reimagine how we design these policies, both in terms of rural and urbanness, but also about mobility and density and other such factors. And this has been a key finding of multi-country studies World Bank has done, as was influenced their thinking about with that facility they made available.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Varun. So also to have some practitioners practice from bureaucracy point of view, we have Mr. Samir Unhale, sir, who is joining us from Mumbai. And sir is Joint Commissioner at Department of Municipal Administration at Government of Maharashtra. Samir, sir, over to you.
Yeah, so very good evening. This issue of employment, urban employment, especially after this impact of COVID, is an extremely important topic that we have. Many times, some people would feel, that employment and urban issues, because urban areas are a great magnet to migration, and therefore there would be an adequacy of all jobs in urban areas. I mean, that has not been the case essentially. In fact, I would not, I mean, in fact, one of the first programs was in the early 90s for employment in urban areas. I think it was called as NRY, or the Nehru Rozgar Yojana, in the early 90s, in which some of this wage programs were made. I think we have almost now crossed over 25 years, and we are discussing a probability of a similar intervention that might be required for the urban poor. I think a lot of things have changed, and direct translation of a rural sort of wage employment program into urban may not be exactly feasible. And need of continuous government programs and interventions for wages may not be long-term and sustainable programs in a way. So I personally feel that the ability of an urban area to generate employment is much more than what we feel it is. Secondly, there is always a greater resilience in urban areas to generate wages in the service sector. Wherever need is felt due to special circumstances in which there is a need of creating such support, I think can be made as a short-term measure. But thinking of a long-term long-term activity, I don't know, how the people would respond to that. And secondly, as you see, the traditional wage employment which you have seen in rural areas, as such, may not be directly applicable in urban areas, for that matter, because the all said and done, the cities, or bigger cities at least, are more service-centered cities, and whatever urban infrastructure projects come, and maybe the housing or construction sector, if you look at, then the marrying of such a urban wage program with the private sector in cities may not be exactly very smooth functioning as far as the regular administration of a program is concerned. Third aspect, I think we were discussing earlier, I had felt that the urban India would be more attuned to, say, technology. And in fact, even right now, the PM Swanidhi program is going, and many interventions or support has been made for the street vendors. Even a digital component is going on very strongly. And therefore, the reliance essentially on government intervention for create employment for urban areas, I think would be a short-term measure. We will have to create a resilience in the city economy. In fact, so we had done a project also earlier, trying to identify the GDP of the city, and IMPRI had done a very great job there. In fact, one of the first of such attempts which was made. And therefore, as far as employment is concerned, it may not be traditional, Narega sort of thing in cities. It is probably has outlived its utility, at least in urban area. That's my personal view. And urban employment, if at all it is to be supported by the cities, it can be done more into maybe upskilling the needs and training part, and maybe creating a structure. Right now we see a gig economy or shared economy, or use of technology for getting the urban services. We are seeing so many activities in private sector, in fact, happening. Maybe the urban clap to name, if we are supposed to name some of such ventures. So the transition into a service sector economy in urban area would require some. I mean, that's the reason I feel that government-sponsored wage employment program may not be feasible for a very long duration and very long measures, because the dependency on welfare doleouts, I personally feel, has a limitation, and we have to create a system which is strong enough to be generating its own resources and supporting its own people who are working into that sector. So I think technology will be an important part. Now we are into the third decade. Now adoption of this technology has also been very strong in urban area, and therefore its impact on urban employment, and or rather the use of digital technology into urban employment, will also be a strong factor that we will have to consider when we are thinking of urban employment and the policies which we might will like to have. So Arjunji, that was my the very limited intervention on that. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you, Arjunji.
Thank you so much, Samir sir, for sharing some of. In fact, many public works program also started from housing, homestead in 80s and 90s, as sir has really highlighted. And Amit sir, now we will come back to you to respond to some of the things which have been highlighted. I also wanted to add that, sir, since most of the things for this public employment, not guarantee, but to provide at this tough time. Also, we have pandemic, so social distancing, mask, other things. So you were also suggesting during the end of your slides that some strategy you were also thinking, and what kind of works wherein we can employ them, some selected, because even we see in our city economy, even the waste collection and other things are also being privatized by the city governments. There is a lot of that thing also. And sir, also you touched upon doubling the NSAP. That was really good. Many less people, and it really caters, but we give 300, 200, 500. That's such a less amount. I think that was a really very good thing. And really on this employment part also, I just because of the nature of work and other things, I'm sure you'll touch upon. Many, including Delhi, many government have come up with portals for laborers that who want to work, and in Delhi, aligning with the private participants, NGOs, more than 2 million, 20 lakhs such job has been given by this portal in Delhi. UP government also, migrant mapping and reskilling program. More things have come, but really with the very active participation from the civil society and private. Government usually want to shy away from any of this, contract tender and so much of things. So, sir, how do you see all these things happening? And in terms of why, because sir, you also said 54,000 crores, what was your outlay, and half of the casual workers as, sir, how do we identify them? Because urban, we do not have the SCCC data, our employment exchange data for that shows around 3 crores of unemployed figures. The recent registry we have, what plans or mapping, sir, you have done for all these things? Over to you, Amit sir. Yes.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for these excellent comments. A lot of them are actually very useful for me to also take away and think a little bit more. So these are just going to be initial reactions, obviously. Most of them I would like to think more about. I'll just start with one point, which is actually not something that was mentioned here. Maybe Professor Mehrotra also alluded to it briefly. This is about the fiscal position of the government. And that's of course an important one, because we are talking about a lot of additional outlay and burden on the fisc. So I just wanted to point the audience to a recent working paper that we've just brought out on our website by one of my colleagues, Ziko Dasgupta, on how a debt GDP neutral financing is possible. So if keeping the debt GDP ratio from rising, let's say you set a target to it, how much fiscal space can be available, where will the money come, where can it come from? And not surprisingly, it has to come from some form of higher taxes if you don't want to simply incur debt on. I mean, of course, you can do that too. There's a school of thought that says that there's no problem with letting the debt GDP rise for now because it's rising everywhere in the world. It's not like India is the only country that it's rising for. So, but if you are being conservative and want to anchor the debt GDP ratio somewhere, where will the money come from? And there it's possible to raise it from taxes, which brings me to the second point that was made by Dr. Neeraj Prasad, which was on the point of counterfactuals and the losses in the pandemic. So I'll take the losses part first and then go to counterfactual. See, it is a pandemic, as you said, and there will be losses. The question is, what should be the distribution of losses in an ethical society? So the path that we seem to have chosen is to place the costs disproportionately on those who cannot bear them. So what we have seen, what the CMI data shows and what other indicators also show is that on the one hand, there have been people whose savings have expanded greatly because, of course, of mobility restrictions, they haven't been spending and so forth. So both in terms of upper income households, I'm talking about the top 5% or so, and in terms of the corporate sector, there's a lot of savings. And of course, investment will not happen right now because of lack of demand, which is a different macro issue that we can go to. So what we need to ask ourselves is, how do we apportion the burden of the pandemic in an ethical way? And it seems to me that a lot remains to be done to ensure that we do not keep pushing the costs onto those who are the most vulnerable. And that requires the government to spend. There is not much other way to do it. The rebound in the private economy will happen. But as I said, the hole in the balance sheet is not going to go away. Not to mention the long-term effects of malnutrition and health and education and so forth. So none, or debt accumulation. So if you want to pay back debts, if you want to do other things that you can't do because your incomes have taken such a big hit, you need some help right now. So that's kind of my answer to connected to the 2 points. Who should pay for the crisis? And that includes a reordering of our priorities, both in terms of taxation and spending. And the sooner we do that, the better we emerge ethically as a society from this crisis. The counterfactual point is very well taken. We haven't done that work, and we should. So let me think about it a little bit more and see, how we can sort of put some numbers on what would have happened if certain actions had been taken early on, let's say in June or even earlier May and so forth. So we would like to do that, and we will. Coming to, there was an interconnected set of points on, can urban schemes be like rural schemes? And I think this is a very important point that was made by Ms. Urvashi Prasad also, and also by by Varun, as well as in the end by Mr. Unhale also. He said it, that the urban context is very different from the rural context. Not only labor markets function differently, but local democracy functions differently. Community bonds are not there, as was also mentioned. So many of these things make the scheme design and functioning very different in urban areas. That is also why we've actually been saying that the urban employment guarantee should not be thought of as NREGA for towns. At its core, it may have some guarantee element, but most other design principles can and should differ between the town and the village, because the context is so different. So I couldn't really agree more there. So to use the words that Ms. Urvashi Prasad used, you can't do a copy paste from rural areas there. So the thinking has to be, how does an urban employment program look different in the rural area than the rural areas? And that brings me to the last point that I want to make, which is connected to the migration point that was raised, and Mr. Unhale's point about welfare or dole versus private sector employment generation in the urban areas. So one very important difference is, of course, that urban labor markets are much more dynamic than rural. They don't have the seasonal unemployment, as I mentioned earlier, or much less so, and they are able to, in normal times, create a fair amount of employment. The caveat here is, of course, COVID, which is the immediate context that we are talking about. So one can talk about an emergency program here, but Mr. Unhale's point remains in a general sense. So there, the question is, do we still need a program like this once those labor markets have bounced back? And I think we do, for at least two reasons. One, actually, if you look at the data on the number of days that casual workers work in urban areas, about 25% in the PLFS data, about 25% get about 3 to 4 days of work a week. So most casual workers work 15 or 20 days in a month. They do not work a full month, not most, excuse me, the bottom 25%. The median worker works about 6 days. So, and then that varies a lot by smaller towns and so forth. So there are urban labor markets where there is a serious underemployment problem, even when the degree of urbanization in India is low. So if more people were to migrate from rural to urban areas, that would only deepen the underemployment problem at a given rate of labor demand. So I do think there's a case to be made for public works creation to take care of the underemployment problem and bring up earnings in towns. Whether you do it exactly like NREGA does it or not, that's a separate issue, and I think we should not do it exactly the way NREGA does it, because urban labor markets have long-term contracts where workers work. They may not want to break those and come to work on a public works site. So we have to design public works in a different way, which brings me to the second justification for why we still need an urban employment guarantee, which is that we have a serious undersupply of public goods in our towns and cities. Most of us live in metros, which are the best serviced of our cities, and they are also not particularly good. So you can imagine what many of the smaller towns, which are much more under-resourced, would be like. Public goods is a serious problem in our country, and we have a huge contrast between the quality of private goods that one can buy and the quality of public goods available to us. We need to fix this urgently. Whether you look at it from the supply side perspective of ease of doing business, because firms don't operate efficiently if there are power cuts or bad roads, or you look at it from a quality of living perspective for citizens. All of this requires investment in public goods, and that requires employment, because people need to do this work. Whether it is cleaning up lakes, whether it is mending roads, whether it is taking care of children when women go out to work. We haven't talked about the incredibly low labor force participation rate, part of which is due to domestic care work responsibilities. So many of this, public provisioning of care, public provisioning of ecological services, public provisioning of other public goods, including roads and so waste collection and so forth, all of this is an urgent need in towns. And that can be done by the government most effectively. You can do an outsourcing, you can have private contractors and so forth, but you're not going to get private capital very easily to do this. And if you do it, then you will get problems of enclosures and shutting out of people who actually deserve these services. So you don't want that model either. I mean, we don't want a park which is gated and only rich people can go to the park. That defeats the purpose of a public park. So public goods are publicly provided, and that requires public employment. So we don't think of this as welfare or dole. We think of it as a way of providing these services while also creating jobs for people. So these were just some of very quick reactions that I had, but I'm happy to go into details or let people respond as well.
Yes, thank you. So few things I also thought just to bring into the deliberation, especially from the point of policy. And so this was a really good argument that underemployment is something we often miss talking about employment. And Sir has really highlighted also in his study that women are the worst affected. So the kind of care, different ecological and other needs Sir is really highlighting. Sir, in urban sector, we also had this strategy, a draft national urban policy framework, which gained some traction till last year. And then also similarly with what the national employment policy in the pipeline, there is always thrust of all the year, between around budget or so, or different occasion, some talks come, but really in urban scenario also that strategy is not coming. I am also saying this because now what our strategy is also, changing. We have national infrastructure pipeline, which has 1 crore sort of budget, more than 7,000 project. We have so many smart cities, our Amrut program, and then Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, RERA, REIT, so many of things also coming. Swachh Bharat Mission, NULM also we have, and then we also have special economic zones, the kind of manufacturing-led growth strategy. We also have services, but that strategy, and we also have industrial corridors, and so many, all the cities are also having development authorities, and so many plethora of new parastatals. So they really have the capacity. So that is why I was just thinking to bring also this, that how do you see the whole of the ecosystem will work, and now we can harness this. So should we go to Professor Santosh Mehrotra to add few things, or to have more detailed, technical, nuanced conversation with you, Amit sir? Then we go to our panelist for some short comments.
Sure.
Santosh sir, over to you.
Arjun, thanks very much. I just want to make a couple of points. And perhaps Amit might elaborate on them when he concludes. And I would particularly like to hear what he said in passing at the end of his initial presentation about employment policy and where this would figure. And because I'm a strong advocate of an employment policy, which this government doesn't have. In fact, this government, or no government, in fact, since 1991 has even had an industrial policy. Forget about an employment policy. And if we are in a situation where we already had, before COVID, a 45-year high in open unemployment, which is unprecedented in our country's history. And now the situation has become worse. So we have to become much more agile in respect of our policies, and particularly employment policy is one of them. But let me make two very specific points about the urban employment guarantee. One is that, and I think Amit makes this point in his paper, although he didn't make it in his presentation, that this is not a scheme meant for metros. We do not want more congestion in our metros. We already have too many people in our metros. On the other hand, we have hundreds, if not thousands, of tiny towns which are extremely badly provided with public services, because the urban local bodies are extremely poorly funded, and they are, and I'm really hoping for some good news on this on the 15th Finance Commission in 3 days' time. And if we do not improve the quality of our public services, we will not, in our small towns and cities and tier 3, 4 cities, we will not be able to attract the investment which will create the urban jobs in industry and in services that we would like to see happen, because that alone is going to pull workers out of agriculture, not an urban Manrega. So the point is not that this is supposed to be an urban Manrega. So, I mean, anyone who thinks this to be an urban Manrega has not understood my final point. And this is in response to Mr. Romale. And I should tell Mr. Romale that I've spent many years working for the government of India in the rank of Secretary to the government of India. I don't want to say these things, but I have to at this point. And I've studied the skills program of the country for 10 years. I wrote the skills chapter for the 12th five-year plan. And I would like to say that the skills programs of the government are not leading anywhere. If you'd like to know the one statistic, I think it should shock you. And it should, the lady from the Niti Aayog should also particularly know this, that in 2012, the share of the workforce which had formal vocational education or training was 2.3%. After 6 years of Skill India, the NSS data told us in 2018 that the share of the workforce which had formally acquired vocational education or training had moved from 2.3% of the workforce to 2.4% of the workforce, 0.1% of the workforce increase in a 6-year program of Skill India. So, you know, the theoretical arguments and the empirical evidence from internationally is that skill programs work best when they are demand driven, not supply driven, when they are by the private sector, not by the government. We have the exact opposite. And therefore, let's not even begin to say, oh, we want to skill people, etc., because it's not, let's not pretend that the government people know what sectors they should be skilled in, what skills they should be provided, because there is not much evidence to suggest that the skills programs so far are actually providing the jobs that are necessary. There is plenty of evidence to the contrary. Back to you, Amit.
Thank you. Arjun, how do you want me to proceed? I mean, I of course agree with most of what Professor Mehrotra said. Let me just say very briefly, Professor Mehrotra, just to continue, and your excellent point about how to see some such public spending in the context of private crowding in private investment. I mean, this is an absolutely key point. And in the context of a national employment policy, the way one can think about it is that the metro-driven growth model is now, sorely been tested in COVID and really exposed for what it is. It is a very dangerous way to go. This is not the first, it's not going to be the last such shock we see. So we need a far more distributed pattern of growth. We need a far more distributed pattern of employment generation. And here there's a lot to learn from. Not only, and I won't go to China and so forth, which usually people go to, but even other countries. And in fact, even our own Kerala, in an interesting way, offers different paths to urbanization, where you have a lot more smaller towns, and those smaller towns are not unlivable towns where if you don't have a private vehicle, you're basically walking on the road, and those are the only two options you have. These are well-run small towns. So we are talking about dynamic small towns. And interestingly, a lot of our industrial clusters, again, this is one of those long-term policy focuses as far as the Government of India goes, which is clusters and employment generation through clusters. Many of them are small towns. They may not be tiny towns, but they are towns like Moradabad, which is by no means a metro, right? Or Kanchipuram or something. And these are all large enough employers. They have tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of jobs in these clusters, and they have export potential, they have employment generation potential. But to this day, we have not solved very basic infrastructural problems in these towns. So they can't be competitive. And if we can think of this, such an urban employment guarantee in the context of, can we make Moradabad brass competitive globally, right? It is a huge export industry. Can we make Banaras more competitive? It is one of the largest power loom industries in India now, severely power constrained and so forth. So, you can't solve all of this through an urban employment guarantee, obviously, but you can see it as a way to direct public resources to make these towns dynamic job creators. And what Professor Mehrotra said, that ultimately the structural change problem is going to be driven by the private sector. Nobody expects it to be driven by the government. But if the government does not do its due, then the private sector simply doesn't respond. This is what we have seen time and again, that they will not spend money to skill. They will not spend money to do most of the basic things that they want the government to do. And when the government doesn't do it, they don't do it either. So nobody does it, and we get stuck. So that's the sort of spirit in which we are coming from.
Sir, yes. Two points also I thought to learn. So there are two other levers. So one is minimum wage. So I also thought to ask Professor Santosh Mehrotra that, since we are also talking urban, and so what can be the floor, or as a tool, minimum wage, what can it do? And the second aspect or dimension really are now most of the states also are going for a local reservation. So will cities also have something of that sort? How do you see, sir, these two components, yes, evolving in our labor market?
I will leave the question on the minimum wage to Amit. Amit is the main speaker here today. I'm not the main speaker, but let me respond to your thing about domicile issues. No, look, this domicile issue is a short-term political response to a very constricted labor market where jobs are not growing in the non-farm sector. Our young people are getting better and better educated, especially in urban areas, but not just in urban areas. And those who are in rural areas and getting better educated, including girls, they all want to move to the cities. Therefore, jobs have to grow in the cities. So this is merely a political response, just as the Patel reservation cry and the Marathas reservation cry and so on is that. An employment policy is what this country needs, backing an industrial policy and a manufacturing strategy, but because all the jobs cannot be created in the services sector. And if we did that, then jobs will grow. And all these domicile claims that are and requirements that are being imposed by different states or cities might think about it will begin to fade away. Unfortunately, who's providing the vision in regard to the kinds of employment policy issues or industrial policy issues that I'm talking about? Back to you, Amit.
No, very quickly, I think we're also out of time. So on the minimum wage, I'll just say that, my view, and this is also why we are arguing for something like a public works program, is that in a surplus labor economy like India, and with weak state capacity as well, laws such as minimum wages are not very effective. And that is, just some sort of a, I mean, it's an ethical commitment that we make, and it's a indicator that you are, this is what you think a livable wage is, and so forth. So, for example, the 375 rupees Anup Satpathy report, one cannot disagree with that. But you cannot say that it should be 375 rupees and then it will be 375. It is not going to be. It is going to be whatever it is that the labor market makes it be, which is where the creation of work becomes important, because tightening the labor market is the only way to do it in this kind of a context. When you tighten the labor market, wages will rise. And of course, productivity has to rise alongside. I mean, simply wages cannot rise. But legislating your way out of poor wages is not going to work. I don't think. You can have it, but without the government actively doing this. Or of course, you have a private sector that generates enough jobs that the labor market tightens. That's a different issue. That hasn't happened. That is precisely the problem that we are fighting with now. So if the government steps in to reduce the supply of labor by hiring workers, and in the process creates conditions for job creation in the private sector, then you've got a win-win situation. And that's really what we should be trying to strive for through the national employment policy, which will along the way improve wages also. It must.
Yes, thank you so much, sir. Also, I thought to learn, but in fact, some other day, what sir, you have been also highlighted that unorganized sector welfare board, what Santosh sir has also you have worked upon. Some other day deliberation will also learn more about it. So I think we are well over the time, so we should wrap. Amit sir, would you like to have some concluding remarks on the issue? In just
No, I have said all that I have to say.
Santosh sir, would you like to add anything?
No. Thank you very much. No.
Thank you. So let me take this opportunity to lastly give this vote of thanks for this special lecture, City Conversations on Urban Employment and Social Policy in the Wake of COVID-19, and from IMPRI Center for Habitat, Urban and Regional Studies and Indrastra Global. I thank the speaker for today, Dr. Amit Basole sir, and also thankful to our chair, Professor Santosh Mehrotra, for finding out time and coming here and talking on this very topical issue. I am also thankful to Dr. Neeraj Prasad, Mr. Samir Unhale, Mr. Urvashi Prasad, and Mr. Varun Agrawal. Chandan sir could not join. He's probably on the streets. So thank you, everyone, and have a nice evening. And of course, we have Dr. Amit Basole sir's website for APU Center for Sustainable Employment, which has many research work, papers, and more materials if anyone wants to learn more. Thank you once again, and have a nice evening. Thank you. Thank you, Santosh.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you.